thank you for coming. Thank you, Conrad. We said we were going to do some magic and levitate the Golden Gate. This poem is called The Plaintiff Amara, the Woman of Sodom. I thought it was very odd that her punishment for looking back at the city that burns was to be turned into a pillar of salt. It's very strange, isn't it? I know why she looked back. Of course she looked back. Sundered and sinful, caught in the rain of fire, nearly devoured, now inch by long inch, turning to salt. That's me, the blasphemer, sodomite, unsure of what's true, making a break for the shelter ahead, wondering if it will ever sink in. Will I ever learn what we did wrong? Drench me well, downpour, combust me to ash. After the first deluge, they lit the first fire. So now, after the city burns, a merciful downpour, rain hitting the roof like an angelic stranger. But who was I before the thorn of my birth pierced me, before the thread of my death drew me through? After the garden, there was still the world, since the womb cracked open and water poured through. But before fire stitched me in salt to the ground, who was I? Before I traveled through a body into a body, who was I? If I am rain, I should pray for a vessel to hold me. If I am vessel, I should pray for the rain to fill me. The storm has reneged on the deal to abate, and the fire itself seems eternal. The last prophets boarded an ark for departure, but this time, amid fire, I am the water. You are ahead of me 51 paces, leaning on our daughters, hoping they will hold you. This time, I cannot follow you forward. This time, I look back to the city that's burning, and yes, in that moment, doubting believer, I was transformed into the most precious of matter. When the first drops hit me, first I was hollowed. As the downpour commenced, I could feel myself vanish. I became one with the ground in the night of great fire, given eternal life as a priceless pillar, slowly disappearing into the infinity of matter. Not curse, nor condemnation, but salt into water, endless reward. So that's the story of the Sodomite, the wife of Lot. I wrote in 2005 and 2006, I wrote about 40 pages of poetry that I then sort of disappeared somewhere. I put them down in one city, and then I went to pick them up in another city, and they were gone. And so it happens. So I had this whole book that I kept calling my lost book. And I went home to New York where I was living at the time and tried as hard as I could to remember fragments and pieces. And I remembered lines, individual lines, and I just wrote every line I could remember, I wrote it down, and then I organized them together into tiny little poems. And each poem is like no longer than 6 lines, and it's just a series of them. And I called it Journey to Providence because I was driving from New York to Providence a lot at that time, in Rhode Island, but also Providence, of course. So here's what's left of that book, that whole book. This is it. I'm just going to read you the scraps, like Sappho or something, except without the lyre and the Greek island and the lesbian desire. Essentially without everything. Body, a window is thrown, sewn along the seam of eye. Courage, an empty bowl, drained or teeming, drowned or sown along what seems like sky. Well came the problem of where to live, driving through the gray evening, cold rain on the windows, listening to melancholy piano on the radio. Why can't I look at people when I am speaking to them? My touch is an argument for pleasure or pressure. Mornings I run, whip still and drunk at the body's rage. Throughout the poem, there are various references to different artists and musicians and painters that I was reading at the time, including Alice Coltrane, John Yao, Kazim Ali and others. And I just mentioned that because in this next one, there's reference to Anais Nin, who came up in the last one. What her braised thigh did, at any rate. Anyhow. Gorgeous I miss, not salvation, but bliss I adore, discs of green melting snow reveals. When the journal of music gave way to the journal of pain, the pages curled themselves into fists and wept. But will I broken, will I undone, at the water, asked to go deeper, a boat dusting linden clears away envy, wandering like lilac snow in dunes, never the water enter the dusk-warm room, will I let you wing me, will I have leapt skyward? There is a dream past all unsleeping, a fire turned friend and held. If we are wedded, how does the wind go through me, carving monoliths and caves, valley conversant in streaks of light, my tongue disappear into dusk's many tongues? There is no one to write this sadness, how hard it is going to be to live without him, a lonely gathering, a haze, a crated shrine, air thick and healing itself, unraveled, collapsed into who would have known the cost of breaking. I could have told you, with a lurch, we are all of a sudden airborne. And this is the last, the series goes on for quite some time, but this is the last scrap that I'll read. This is the one that references Malevich. Prepare to open the leaves, not a canticle of wind, but reverie or revelation. The black square meaning, perhaps, a dissolving of the body into the ground. Though isn't this what you were promised and craved? Here, on the frightened bluff, naked in the moonlight, with a view of the foundry spitting up flames and liquid stone, everything we love has been lost. We are in a wilderness. So I referenced Icarus in that earlier poem about the wings, and most of this book is about Icarus. He comes all the way through it. So I'll just read one of the poems from the Icarus sequence. There's about 12 of them in this book. This one's called The Escape. It's not actually the first Icarus poem, it's the third or fourth one, but it's the first one of the dramatic story when he leaps out of the labyrinth, which is the exciting part, yeah. Well, he's still hopeful. He doesn't know what's to come. Father whose purpose swims while the universe mends itself, wind was water, porpoise was prophet. Father, my swim, the sutured eventual blue splinters, seed planter, hedonist, heathen when the unwise sun fell to pieces, purposeless when the father flew for cover. The cloven will cleave, the water finishes itself, finishes me. Stream unreeling, you are the end of the world, an endless horizon, and it's a sham, this charnel choice between heaven and home, because finally I'm free of the labyrinth, and overhead, nothing but sky. Poor dear. This is, yeah. All right, I'm going to tell you a fairy tale. I was in another beautiful city of hills looking out on the boundless sea, the city of Haifa. And I wrote this poem there, although it doesn't directly reference that landscape. So here is the fairy tale, the fairy tale. The fairy in the tale is me. In the acres of garden before an empty house, an amnesiac prince collects broken branches, prunes the fruit trees, plucks weeds from the rock bed. He speaks a broken language of beach and Broadway, and on the way to shore gets lost and finds himself in a cemetery at sunset, pink light on the stones. He cannot read the inscriptions but kneels down at a cenotaph anyhow and recites the only prayers he can remember. Why, when we wanted to speak to nothing but water, is he singing verses down into the stone-hard earth in a town he has never belonged to, lost on his way to the shore? If only he would learn to read the book of the sky, he would see the birds circling lazily around hot currents, which could only mean a large body of water is near. The words are hollow in his mouth, and he doesn't know what he believes anyhow, whether bodies will arise again, or if the aerial rumors of the gulls will lead him to the sea, or if the numb tombstone in his mouth might indeed speak. His scripture comes out sideways, and his mispronunciation of the most sacred of syllables makes him always friendless. It's nearly a party trick, the way he opens his mouth and butterflies pour out, closes it again, and the clock chimes, reminding him of being a young boy, coming home to an empty house, sure that he had been forgotten, that everyone had gone to the beach without him, sure that he would always be forgotten, that he would lie down in his grave and no ghost would come to fetch him or explain God or what was supposed to happen next, that the grave would fill with dirt and he would rise on the boat of his body, that no one would recite the sacred chapters for him, that he wouldn't know how to take the rudder, that the sea was too far, the boat now coming apart, his voice dwindling, hard as stone. Finally, he sees a bird winging down, calling, "Find me, find me." But he doesn't understand words, only sound, the shape of words, the tune to which they are sung. All the sacred verses in the world are to him like birds wheeling in the sky. Who knows where they go? I promised I would read an autobiographical poem today that was not like symbolic or mythological, but just direct. This is what I have to offer you. It's called autobiography. I get more basic than that. And it tells of a time when I was visiting the city of Granada in Spain, which is not only an Arab city, but has a weird thing that is happening now, which is that, of course, the Arabs were expelled and suppressed and killed dead, but the new Arab and African immigrants who are moving to Granada are moving into the old hoods. So the Albaicin, which is the classic Arab neighborhood from back in the day, is once again the Arab neighborhood of Granada. Very strange. And I was in Granada when I heard on the morning news, of all places in the world, the Spanish morning news show, the Good Morning America of Spain, Good Morning Spain, covered the death of Mahmoud Darwish, the great Arab poet. And I was like coming out of the shower and that was on the news. Our hotel was weirdly on the corner of Calle San Anton being the patron saint of lost things, and Calle Duende. So here's my autobiography. At the corner of San Anton and Duende, I hardly know the edge of the sidewalk, a bare consonant of the city's harsh sentence. How can I say my actual name when all I can manage is counting change for coffee I do not buy? Every night, the clouds argue in the sky for the right to be the one who will part to reveal the new moon, blank but appearing, day by day, a new misunderstanding of gone. How can you already know if you have never yet been? The twin inside arriving after departure, the crime of history, a quivering vessel, my also bones a manic making. Who am I? A man inside a bell inside someone else's face. Fingers that hold a skull or pen. Of course a swan could be an elephant or a man could be on fire. The coffee I didn't drink is pouring through time. Inside any city, 1,000 vowels pronounce themselves. Every street map has 1,000 pointing arrows labeled, you are here. But who are you? At the corner of St. Anton and Duende, dark-eyed and holding your empty. Nobody knows you, hardly arriving and already gone. I read to you a poem called The Wrestler, because the International Olympic Committee has just decided, apparently, they're going to meet again to hear the appeals on the decision, but the decision was to remove the sport of wrestling from the sports. It's ancient, it's the beginning in Olympics, is those Greek dudes and some oil. But it removed it for golf. And there's some politics around, race politics, obviously, because these countries, the wrestling was a sport that was won by many different countries, and it's huge, of course, in Turkey and Iran and Pakistan and places of that nature. And I found myself weirdly in solidarity with Donald Rumsfeld, who wrote this sort of interesting editorial defending wrestling. Yeah. Except, paragraph 5, not so great, because he was saying how it's harkens back to the martial purpose of competition, and it's maybe that's why they got rid of it, because they are all interested in the international cooperation or something like that. So, anyhow, but I was commissioned in the summer by NPR, along with several other poets, to write poems on the Olympics, and we each were supposed to select a sport. And I actually chose diving and wrote about Greg Louganis, but another poet also chose that, and I had to come up with a new poem. So this is my poem, and I was at Squaw Valley at the time, which was fortunate because you had to write a poem every day, and it's kind of a boot camp situation. And I wrote this poem called The Wrestler, which has now mysteriously been embraced by the wrestling community. It's appearing on all these different blogs. And, seriously, and this one guy who's the director of an MMA academy has written a whole analysis about how correct that I really got the spirit of the physical competition of wrestling in this poem. So I'm really happy about that. I believe he missed the subtext. Perhaps. So here's The Wrestler. My flat breath grows flatter. Who am I now, thick in the tricks the body plays? No matter. The fact of this day on fire and these arms twisted in the effort to master another draws me in time breathless to afternoons as a boy, slick with sweat and laughter, horizontal in a spin, one of us in control and the other on his back, and vested. Later, I would read in heaven's books how my body was wrong, though limber and strong. In the web of our efforts, I aim to fix a position where the other's strength ebbs and mine kicks in. Strength splintered to pieces, a shard in the other we each struggle to reach. We give, in turn, strip down and shift. I reach for one limb with my right hand, grip harder, to another with my left. Our bodies flash their thunder and lack. I strain for what I'm owed. I read heaven its riot act. So that's that poem. I'm going to read a poem called Dear Shams. It answers a poem that's in my first book, The Far Mosque, called Dear Rumi. And Shams disappeared at the end of that poem, and Rumi this is the story of Rumi and Shams, the mystic Rumi. When his friend abandoned him, he looked for him for a long time and he couldn't find him. And then he said, at some point he said, I am Shams. He's me, so I don't have to look for him anymore. And that was sort of spiritual lesson there. And that was good enough for me at that time. But then, you know, the years go by and I thought, you know, do you really have that moment, or are you always missing that, wanting some physical manifestation of that spiritual realization? So I had to write the sequel, and that's this poem, Dear Shams. There is no answer to winter. Sun sets over water, falling so quickly. You have not been lost, listening for silence. Where and where did you go? 12-stringed music, rejoin me. In the sun year, I swelled long shadows. In the moon year, the valley folded itself up. You are the beloved I would not love. At the fountain, witless and still, a stream pours over rocks making music. Could the water rush over me? Could you rush over me? The sun drops so quickly into its banishment. Could I please forget to breathe and drown? Will the ocean rejoin me? You have not been lost. Can I be reborn as a guitar and you reborn as music to hum inside me? One day you stopped looking at me and I knew the last note was lingering in the box of my body. You did not vanish in the marketplace. I still imagine you in me as breath, broken in thirds, chorded to sound. I took your name when the sun came up. Sun of winter, sun windless and wistful, come down across the water. Undone sun, give me the drunk, go ahead. Last time I searched for you. This time I stretched, hollow and resonant. Last time I raved without senses. This time, my angel, my string singer, pluck me, oh pluck me and hum. So, it's a little sassy at the end, yes. I'm going to read a couple more, two more poems from my experiences in the Middle East, and then I'll close with a final Icarus poem. I went and visited the Middle East for about 2 months. I was mostly in the Palestinian West Bank, but I also went to Jerusalem and all over Israel and Galilee also, and Haifa and Jaffa, etc. So I was in Bil'in, which is one of the small Palestinian villages in the hills, north and west of Jerusalem. And we saw from the roof of the rooftop terrace of the apartment building these bright lights. Now in the territories, not only is the water carefully rationed, so the settlements have fountains and swimming pools and beautiful lush lawns, and it's a desert climate, and so the Palestinian villages don't have those things, including one of the settlements has a water park in it. But they also have the ration of the electricity. So the settlements are very brightly lit, like the shopping malls that you would see here or the parking lots, and many of the villages, actually the houses are on their own generators, or they have like a curfew of electricity, etc. I'm not talking about Ramallah or the West Bank cities, I just mean the Palestinian villages. And mostly in the West Bank, the settlements are built next to villages, actually, for whatever the various geographic purposes for these settlements being built. Many of them are built on top of the water aquifers or in the hills, elevated places. So in Bil'in, we were in the apartment and we saw these bright lights. And I said, well, what's the name of this settlement, these bright lights? And our host, Iyad Bernat, whose brother is the director, his brother is Imad Bernat, who's directed that film, 5 Broken Cameras, that's been nominated for him. So Imad was also there that night, same night. It was actually Imad's house, but Iyad was hosting us. So I said, well, what is this settlement? And Iyad said, that is Tel Aviv. It's right there. Because this country is really small. So it was really weird. Like, you would stand on this really roof of this like really run down, like very just rough little shack of a building, and this major world city basically is right there that you can see. And he said, yeah, we can see the sea in the daytime, we can see the Mediterranean. But there's a very strict caste system where men under the age of 60 are not, Palestinian men under the age of 60 are not allowed passage into the Green Line Israel proper, and women under the age of 40, at any rate. So they were these people who kind of grew up never seeing this sea and not being able to go there. My explanation is long for such a short poem, but that's how the situation is over there. There seems like a lot of explanation to understand just a little bit of reality. So here's the little poem. Sorry that my explanation is so long, but... The evening in the distance speaks the tongue of fire. Empty canisters glitter in the field. The sun shines always in the next country, but our darkness has no measure. We translate the hill of spring into the language of snow. Night, lie down here on the roof in August and listen to the sound of the fountains on the other side of the wall. A long time before we argued about historiography, each woman grew time in the bullet-laden fields, and each man measured in his mind the distance between his jail cell and the illuminated, boundless sea. And the second Middle East poem I'll read you is, I'll close with this poem, how's that? Since I like to leave some time for discussion, etc. This is a poem called Promise Keeper. I realize that in American parlance that's like a men's movement, the Promise Keepers. And I don't mind, that's okay, you can have that meaning as well. But at any rate, it sort of riffs off of this promised land and this one little piece of real estate that everyone likes to argue about, which is the Muslim people call it Al-Aqsa, the high place, and the Jewish people call it the Temple Mount. And in Muslim Quran, it's the place where the Prophet was taken on his journey to heaven. He went to that rock and then he jumped up into heaven. In the Bible, it's the place where Adam and Eve came into the garden on that stone. At any rate, the stone is still there. I went, I saw it, I touched it. Massive, like bigger than this room. The Promise Keeper. In the place mountains keep time as they slide into the sea, you made a promise you never kept. You fastened yourself lonely to everything that lived, wanted to open every closed door, wanted to turn your back on the sky and teach yourself how to fly. Speak in the language of myth and flowers if you must, but translate it at least for the stone and dust. You built a tower to God out of bricks and mud when you should have built it with breath. Wings will not carry you skyward. Your own body is the only mosque you need, the tongue in your mouth, the only rock from which you could ever launch yourself into heaven. Thank you.